and welcome to the Brookdale Writer Series. My name is Suzanne Parker. I'm part of the English faculty here at Brookdale, as well as the director of the Visiting Writer Series. Today, I'm very excited to be speaking with Mimi Schwartz. Mimi is the author of the wonderful book, Thoughts from a Queen-Sized Bed. And she has a forthcoming book called Good Neighbors, Bad Times, Echoes from My Father's German Village. I've actually been lucky enough to be able to read an advanced copy of this book, and it is just a really smart, interesting book. So I'm really happy to have the chance to talk to you today.
Well, I'm delighted to be here.
One thing I find really interesting about these two books is how you're able to take really large issues of the Holocaust and the war and mortality, even just marriage and things like that, and you filter them through a very personal perspective. And, I really love that. So I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about your approach as a creative nonfiction writer.
Well, I think I always start with a particular and sometimes an anomaly, like why is this happening, or something where I'm working against my expectations, like with my marriage book. It was Tolstoy's idea that all happy families are alike and only unhappy families are interesting. And all the marriages that I had been in for a long time had this up and down motion, that we were not all, we had the same issues as the unhappy marriages. And so I got into looking at a particular marriage, which happened to be mine, to try to capture the complexity of it, and hoping that the small story will lead to the large story, which I think that's the way I operate. And I think with My Father's German Village, it was the same way. I had not wanted to write about my German past, not wanted to write about the Holocaust, and then again had something happen that went against my expectations, and that was that I heard a story of the Christians in My Father's German Village rescuing the Torah on Kristallnacht. And I thought, wow, this is not what I had grown up thinking about. And so again, I wanted to investigate who these people were, particularly in this one little village. And then through that, I think, which took me a very long time because I didn't know very much about this world the way I knew about my marriage, I found again that these small stories of individual lives led me to a much more complicated understanding of the larger historic narrative. So,
well, I love it because you're able to look at these large issues, and there's a real human voice to your writing, and you're also just awfully funny. Thoughts from a Queen-Sized Bed is just a wonderful, smart, and funny book. Could you talk a little bit about it? Just what it is, what it's about?
Yeah, well, it's my take on life on a long marriage, what you get and give up for it. And I think one of the things that you need to get through a long marriage, we've been married 40 years, is a sense of humor. I mean, if it's all very dark and serious, it's tough to get through. And it started actually, I didn't think it was going to be a book about marriage. It started out as 6 months in our relationship after we had both gotten sick, mortally ill, and how we had what we called our recuperative honeymoon. And that then, in the end, became the middle section of Thoughts from a Queen-Size Bed, which is that the first section is of the things that you worry about at night, that are the little things like moths in the closet and who's going to go to the cleaners, and but they go away in the morning. And the second section then is about the big things, which is both my husband and I. What happened is that I had breast cancer, and my husband had a heart attack within 2 weeks of each other. And so that's actually what drove me to end up writing creative nonfiction. I had been writing fiction, and that was so incredible that I thought, well, I can't write about this as fiction, and then became interested in the real world and trying to make that come alive in the same way as as the fictional world.
The fiction, yeah.
And then the third part of the book is the things that don't go away, but so what? So that's how it got organized. Yeah.
Now, did you always know you were writing towards a book, or you started with this 6-month? Would you say second honeymoon?
Recuperative honeymoon.
Recuperative honeymoon.
Both
Sorry.
sort of nursed ourselves back to health. No, I started out writing individual essays, and they were being published individually. And then about 2/3 of the way through the book, I decided that I had a book that would be like a memoir, linked essays about marriage. And that then, it's actually quite funny, is then I realized where the holes were, like I really needed to have a really good fight, which I didn't have in the book yet. And so we were driving to Cape Cod for a wedding, and about 3 minutes after we left the house, we got into a discussion of who forgot the map to Cape Cod. And the dialogue was so good that after about 10 minutes, I said, this is my fight. And I actually started to write down, some of the dialogue.
Now, did that actually stop the fight or simply escalate it?
No, I was actually being a very ethical, creative nonfiction writer in that I informed my husband. I said, I'm taking this down because it may end up being in the book. And he was so annoyed about the map that it didn't bother him at all. He kept on going. And so there is an essay in the book called A Map to Cape Cod, which is one of the ones that then, once I knew there was a book, I was looking for the holes, the different things that I needed to fill in. Yeah.
Well, actually, I was going to ask, because the book really is very funny. And Stu, your husband, is just this wonderful character in the book. And I was wondering if you might, because this is probably one of my favorite essays in the book, Negotiating Monogamy.
Sure.
And I was wondering if you just read just the first few paragraphs,
okay,
if you wouldn't mind. I've kind of marked it there.
Okay. For Stu, monogamy is like being on a diet. Break it with one small, delicious bite, and you end up eating everything in the refrigerator. Plus, you're too full for dinner. I have resisted him on this. You sound like my Orthodox grandfather, I said, when we first started talking about being faithful around 5 years after the honeymoon. It was the 1960s, and open marriage, meaning permission to sleep with whomever, was in vogue. That may be, but if you have an affair, I'll divorce you, Stu kept saying, never one to be fashionable. How could you so easily, I would ask, amazed that he could say goodbye just like that. We had so much going, a new house, 2 little kids, but I didn't doubt him, a stubborn man who saw the world in black and white, even if I preferred grays. I would be more forgiving, I was sure, at least the first time, at least in theory. Yet whenever I felt his good chemistry with another woman, I felt betrayed. I could flirt. I needed to flirt. But he was only supposed to talk to dull, ugly women.
Actually, I wanted to ask you a question.
Sure.
I love the opening there about, for Stu, monogamy is like being on a diet. It's wonderful. It's a wonderful line. As a creative nonfiction writer, I mean, in the argument in the car, you're writing about your family to a great extent. What is that like? Did they all sign release forms at the beginning?
No, but I like to say about Thoughts from a Queensize Bed that I may be one of the only people who wrote about a marriage that she was still in and planned to stay in and called it nonfiction. But I think that what happened is that the first part that became the middle part of the book when we were both sick, I was writing. I would bring a draft of something about what was happening to us down in the morning, and we would use that. It was like I was writing for both of us, and there was this interaction in terms of trying to get that experience right on the page. And I only did that for the middle part of the book, but I think it was empowering for Stu. He felt as if he had part of himself in that, and he was being represented. And I took that over to the rest of the book, in that no matter how much I will knock him, I will also give him his chance to knock me back. And so I think not only does it add some kind of authenticity, but it makes it okay with him. He feels like I got the complexity down on the page. I think a lot of time in memoir, if you don't empower the people that you're writing about, that's the time when most often they'll get quite annoyed with you because they feel as if they're stick figures or stereotypical figures.
Oh, Stu is certainly no stick figure in this. You know, you mentioned as well that the first part of the book was that you wrote was your recuperative honeymoon. Do I have it right this time?
Right.
Yeah. I mean, you did go through this incredible trauma physically, as did your husband. Why did you decide to shift? Why? I mean, was there a choice of I'm not going to write another cancer memoir? I won't do that.
I actually wrote a whole memoir about, and I was trying to look at the relationship between marriage and illness, and how in marriage, when the crises come, you either go one way, it either sinks you or it makes you closer.
Yeah.
And in our case, we had a lot of tensions before, and when this both happened to us at the same time, we just sort of totally got close. So I was interested in that. Why did it happen? How did it happen? And started to write, I did write a whole memoir about that. And, but then I felt like years passed, that was not our whole life. I mean, the thing is, if you write a memoir about illness, it defines you. And so I felt like that was one thing that happened to us. And so it was an important thing, but we are individuals and people around that, beyond that, before that and after that. And so I wanted to capture the whole complexity of where one crisis fits into a long-term relationship.
Well, you do see a lot of those kind of memoirs now. You know, here's my Tourette's memoir, or here's my, cancer memoir, or something like that. I like the way your book pulls from different places. It is the story of a marriage, much more than just that one moment, which is nice. Now, you had said that that writing this book was a catalyst for your next book. That there was an element that carried over. I read that for Good Neighbors, Bad Times.
Right. Well. I guess in a couple of ways. One, in this book, I do have a piece about growing up in Forest Hills as, a child of German Jewish refugees and wanting very much to be an American, and to not have this past as a burden on me. And so that was the first time that I wrote about that, and that was certainly I was bringing that persona to this second book, but the second book was a book that I really didn't plan to write, didn't want to write, and I think I call myself the reluctant researcher. I wrote it in spite of my own instincts to not write about this village.
Well, I hate to stop you on that, but it's a great place to stop. I wrote it in spite of my instincts. We need to take a break, and we'll come back and we'll talk more about Good Neighbors, Bad Times: Echoes of My Father's German Village.
Great.
Hi, I'm Loana Morales. Did you know that the Brookdale Center for Visual Arts is a great place to explore different genres of communication? It is located right here on campus next to Larison Hall. Art is any expression of feelings and ideas and can be told through poetry, photographs, paintings, and sculpture. At the Center for Visual Arts, Brookdale students have a chance to come and experience these presentations. Students and faculty are encouraged to visit the center anytime to consider pieces and share their thoughts on each exhibit. The Center for Visual Arts is open 9 a.m. to 5:30 p.m. Monday through Friday. For more information on visiting the center or participating in other events there, call Marie Maber, the gallery coordinator, at 732-224-2881 or log on to brookdalecc.edu.
I like to rise before the sun, simply for the pleasure of greeting the sun when she rises. As the mist thins and the hungry insects crack the glassy water, toads croak, osprey dive, and sometimes I remember why I came here in the first place.
possible?
When you open a book, you can explore new lands, meet new friends, and discover new adventures. There are amazing possibilities when you open your mind to reading. You can log on to the Library of Congress website and let the journey begin.
Hi, and welcome back to the Brookdale Writers Series. I'm talking today with Mimi Schwartz, the author of Good Neighbors, Bad Times, Echoes of My Father's German Village, which is forthcoming this spring. So welcome back. Before the break, you were talking about sort of the inspiration for the book. So can you talk a bit more about that?
Well, the book is about this little German village that my father was born in and his family had lived in for generations. And it was a village that I was absolutely not at all interested for the first half of my life, I would say. And my father would talk about it with great nostalgia because he would say that when he was growing up, which was about 30 years before Hitler, it was a place where the Christians and the Jews in the village got along very, very well. It was a place that had a strong emphasis on charity, on loyalty, on compassion, on getting along. And and he would use it whenever my sister and I would fight or would be selfish or uncharitable, and he would say, in my village, everybody got along. In my village, you know, people didn't fight like that. And so, of course, whenever I would hear it, shade would go down, and I wasn't at all interested in hearing anything about it. And that continued until about 10 years after he died, when I saw a Torah from the village that had been rescued by the Christians of the village during Kristallnacht. And they had buried it outside of the Jewish cemetery, I was told, and then sent to their Jewish neighbors who had started a new life in a little village in Israel. And there was the Torah on the wall, next to actually the names of the 87 Jews who didn't make it and who was. But what struck me again was this idea of who rescued this Torah and why, and it brought back this echoes of my father's stories about this village, and I became interested in what happens to once good neighbors. Once they're under threat from political extremism that makes it impossible for them to be good neighbors, and how do they negotiate that? So that was what got me into what ended up being a quest into the world, my father's old world, not through him and not through his brothers and sister because they had all died, but through the living rooms and kitchens of both the Jews who left and their Christian neighbors who were still in the village. And because everybody remembered my family, I was die Tochter from Arthur Löwengart, and they welcomed me with all of the home-baked German goodies that I had grown up with as a child.
I was going to mention that. There's a lot of food in this book. It's wonderful sounding food.
Food is the way that people re-enter the past. And it didn't matter whether you were a Jewish woman in Washington Heights serving Linsertort, or whether you were a farmer's daughter in this little village serving Linsertort. And as a matter of fact, I originally wanted to call the book The Linsertort Stories because it felt like every house that I went into, no matter which side of the ocean I was on, they were serving Linsertort. But then people said you'll end up on the Food Channel, so I that
might not be that. That's a new audience.
So, but yes, so I think it's one of the few books where. And what I liked about it, too, was that you had German Christian and German Jewish experience juxtaposed, all remembering the same shared life. And all talking about not only their memories of it, but how that still affected them and shaped them today. So the book is in the present looking back at the past rather than being in the past. As a matter of fact, it's told in present tense so that the reader comes along with me
literally,
as I re-enter.
back to your father's village.
Right.
Can you talk about that? What was that experience like? You had a translator or translators.
I had different translators. I spoke a little bit of German, but not enough for this village, and no one spoke English in this village. And so it turned out that my translators, I had 3 at different times. The book was written over a long period of time, 12 years. They each brought to the experience another point of view. So they each, unplanned, ended up being important characters in the book. The first translator was a young Protestant in Holocaust studies at the University of Mannheim. And he had a grandfather who was in the Confessing Church, which was one of the few Christian groups that really were active against Hitler, and another who was an ardent Nazi and still has a flag in his house. And so and here's this grandson
and he's living
in
with that
Holocaust study,
grandfather, right?
and he's living with this grandfather because he doesn't have enough money for himself. And so, and he never talked politics or about Nazis with his grandfather. But the man in the village who was my main guide, who was the same age as his grandfather, the translator ends up having the conversations he could never have with his grandfather with this man. And so, and I'm sort of like in the middle of all this.
Just taking notes.
And the reader is there too, and trying. So, I mean, I guess one of the things I wanted in telling it in the present tense is that I didn't want to be an expert. It's about trying to make sense of the past and the struggles of the past. And I wanted the reader to be able to struggle with me and not necessarily even form the same conclusions that I'm forming.
It does seem a book that's built around asking questions. I mean, I love that. It seems like you go into this with an awareness of predetermined answers, but a definite willingness to ask questions and to be open. You know, what were the questions you used going in there? What were you looking for?
Well, I first wanted to find out what life was like before, trying to establish what the relationship was between neighbors, and how much was friendship involved, I think the underlying thing was how much was the relationship between neighbors in this village like my relationship with my neighbors in New Jersey, where we also live in a place of, our neighborhood is a mix of Christian and Jews, and we all get along. So there was this echo that how can I find out from this village what I need to know about my own life? And in terms of, and in the end, I think one of the things that the book did for me, and I hope it does for everyone, is to have people ask not only what would I have done then, because I think when you hear the small stories of people, but also what would I do now? Because these people who I interviewed I was not interested in the SS people. I was not interested in the very people who were ardent anti-Semites. I was not interested there was nobody in the village who was a hero like Wallenberg and Schindler. What I was interested in were people who I thought saw themselves as decent, who I could identify with, and how did they negotiate? How did they get through those times? And what does that teach us? And of course, when I started the book, the world was a little bit different than it is now, but since then, with all of what's gone on in Iraq and Rwanda and Bosnia and Darfur, I mean, it seems as if, again, this whole issue of how do neighbors who are wanting to get along sort of negotiate in these times? And
I couldn't help but think that as I was reading through it, that, you know, we've seen this in Iraq with, you know, the Sunnis and the Shiites, just once again, neighbor turning against neighbor. Right. Was there anything when you were writing this book that surprised you? Or when you were researching?
Yes, I mean, there were a number of things that surprised me. One was that how open people were, how you know, willing, one, as the daughter of Arthur Lowengar, but two, just saying, I'm interested in this past. And people would welcome me into their homes and open up their lives, their albums, their stories, revealing things. And I thought that was quite astonishing.
I was surprised as I was reading it.
Great generosity. And my first guide, who was the young Holocaust scholar, he kept on saying this refrain that I always worried about all through the book: don't be naive, don't believe what people tell you. And I heard that also from the Holocaust scholars at the college where I teach, at Stockton College, who would say the same thing when I started. So I was constantly being worried about being naive. But what I found in this kind of book is that when you keep hearing stories about the same place, they both inform each other and challenge each other and take on a kind of complexity that you begin to understand what the truth was, not from one story particularly, but from the juxtaposition of stories and how they build. And so by the end, I didn't feel as if I was being naive, but it was an issue all along. I kept on thinking, am I being naive? Should I be believing this? Should I be here? You know, that kind of thing.
Well, we only have, sadly, a minute left, but it just, in this tiny bit of time, you know, if you had people take one thing away from this book, what would it be?
I would hope that they would have a more complex understanding of words like good, evil, bravery, denial, truth, which is what I think I developed. I went into this thinking, is this village a special place? Yes or no? And that was my initial quest in. I was going to find the answer. And I think what I left with was a much more nuanced, much more complicated understanding of what that past was. And I hope people would take that away too.
Well, I know that I certainly did. So it has been a pleasure talking to you about your upcoming book, Good Neighbors, Bad Times, Echoes of My Father's German Village, and your other book, Thoughts from a Queen-Sized Bed. So thank you for talking with us today, Mimi.
Thank you.